Virginia, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land I call home, the Powhatan and Yidanan nations, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. Tonight, we are hosting the third discussion on Fratelli Tutti, which will center on economics. And before we begin, I would just like to note a couple things to keep in mind. We expect a large crowd, so as you come in, you will be on mute and throughout the presentation as well. If you'd like to post a question for either of our guests or moderator, please use the chat function for that. And we do ask that you use it sparingly to minimize distraction, but please put your questions in there. We welcome them. And just to let you know, we will be recording the presentation and we'll send it out afterwards. And we couldn't be here tonight without the generosity of our various sponsors, who we are so grateful for. Thank you all very much for your support and your collaboration. To begin our time together in prayer, we welcome one of our interns here at Franciscan Action Network, Grace Von Lehman.
Welcome. I invite you to join me in a posture of prayer. Remember that we're always in God's holy presence. Spirit of peace and good, in your presence we recall that we are all made in your image, and that all of our brothers and sisters are created and held by your love. Convict us with your justice that uplifts all these members of our human family and moves us to work always toward unity and peace. Creator, you breathe life into the world and sustain us by your transformative love. Grant us your same love, compassion, and humility as we continue to build a society that sustains all people. God, you remind us that all we have is a gift, and that to whom much is given, much will be required, until it becomes giving of our very selves. Allow us yours to communion that they are, and to commit ourselves to true justice and lasting solidarity with all your sacred people. Amen.
And now Steve Schneck, our Executive Director, will be moderating the discussion this evening.
Well, thank you, Grace, for your prayer. And as you just heard from Nora, my name is Steve Schneck. I'm the Executive Director of Franciscan Action Network. And I'm very pleased this evening to welcome you all to this discussion of Fratelli Tutti and economics. And I'm joined this evening by two really extraordinary scholars in Catholic economics. The first is Dr. Meghan Clark. She is an associate professor of moral theology at St. John's University in New York. She is the author of The Vision of Catholic Social Thought, The Virtue of Solidarity and the Praxis of Human Rights by Fortress Press in 2014. In 2015, she was a Fulbright Scholar at Hekima Institute for Peace Studies and International Relations at Hekima University College, Nairobi, Kenya. Active in public theology, she is a columnist for U.S. Catholic Magazine, and she received her doctorate in theological ethics from Boston College in 2009. Welcome, Meghan. And our second panelist is Dr. Tony Annett, a Gabelli Fellow at Fordham University and a senior advisor at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. His PhD is in economics from Columbia University, and he spent 2 decades at the International Monetary Fund, including as a speechwriter for 2 managing directors. A frequent presence at the Vatican's Dicastery for Integral Human Development, Tony is also a member of the College of Fellows of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology at Berkeley University, and is a Knight Commander of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. So welcome, Tony. And let me say, by the way, that both Tony and Meghan have been great friends over the years. And so I am just so personally happy and grateful to have this discussion with them this evening. I'd like to begin with, I guess, dive right into it. And so my first question is actually a question that I've asked now in 2 of these panels about Fratelli Tutti. And that is to ask you to think about the parable of the Good Samaritan that His Holiness really makes kind of the center of gravity for this encyclical. So I think we all know the parable. The traveler beset by robbers, a Levite and a priest pass by, and then it's the untouchable who ministers, gives, takes care of, and comes back and returns to the injured traveler. So what's the moral of this story from an economics perspective? Maybe you could start, Meghan.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to everyone who's tuned in tonight for our conversation. When the encyclical came out, a lot of people were criticizing, saying, there's so much here, it's all over the place. And you rightly note, the parable of the Good Samaritan really is the core here, right? It is the center of what Francis is trying to do. And it's an unusual one because when we talk about economic justice, we usually talk in Catholic social thought circles about Matthew 25's parable of the Last Judgment and the question of whatsoever you did for the least. We usually talk about the Beatitudes. We don't often talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I think what Francis is doing is he's holding up the parable as something that challenges the way we tend to position ourselves in thinking about questions of social justice. And so Francis's interpretation of the parable is at once personal and social. So he's talking about the people who walk by, right? It's both personal sin and it's social and it's structural. It's in that section that he talks about the failure of the church to, in a timely fashion, address slavery, and which is a social structural problem. And so I think what's really interesting in terms of what does this mean for how we think about economics and economic justice is that he's using the parable of the Good Samaritan as one in which we at different points in our lives are all the different players. And so that challenges us to think differently about the position we play in the parable itself as we reflect on it. But also taking something that people, and this matters especially for an American audience, that people tend to approach and see as a personal thing about being nice to somebody in need, and flips that on its head by linking it to social questions and social sin and structural sin, of which for Francis, inequality is one of the biggest ones he talks about in his papacy. And so I think he's doing something really interesting with the way in which he uses the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's not unique, but he develops it most fully here.
Tony, anything you'd like to add to Meghan's analysis here?
Sure. Just let me start by saying thank you, Steve, and to the Franciscan Action Network for inviting me here tonight. So Meghan gave a great answer from the point of view of a theologian. I'm going to give a less great answer from the point of view of an economist. So I would start by saying the parable of the Good Samaritan, as Francis is elucidating it, if you take it down to economics, it asks the question, it fundamentally asks the question is, who is your neighbor? And the answer is, everybody is our neighbor. But in economics, we don't think about neighbors. We think about self-interest. We think about competition. We think about maximizing our personal benefit. We think about maximizing profits. This is how our economy is structured and how our economics is taught, and how our policy is informed. But if we look at the Good Samaritan, I think one lesson is we move away from all these, from self-interest and all these other, I would say, anthropological pathologies, and look more into solidarity, gratuitousness, reciprocity, the idea that we give not just to get something in return, as you do on the market, or out of compulsion, as you do, for example, when you have to pay your taxes, but simply based on the logic of gift itself. You want to do somebody a good turn, even though you do not get any benefit from doing that. And this, I think is a very profound insight. As Meghan knows, this comes deeply from Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate, the idea that, every economic encounter must be a personal encounter, and sociability and fraternity must be embedded in economic relationships, not outside economics or not after economics. So that's the first point I would make. I would make a second follow-up point, which echoes something of what Meghan says. And this brings me, this obviously isn't the first time Pope Francis has talked about the Good Samaritan. And it's not the first time he's talked about the Good Samaritan in the context of economics. So in 2017, he gave an address to the economy of communion in Rome.
Right. I remember
and
that.
He talked about the Good Samaritan in that context. And he talked about entrepreneurs from the economy of communion who try and do social good with their profits. And he said, basically, an entrepreneur who just acts like the Good Samaritan is only doing half their duty, because they must also take care of the structural injustices that put the robbers on the road in the first place. And I thought that was a very profound insight. And especially as we get back to Fratelli Tutti, and the Pope does again speak about these structural injustices that so dominate our modern economy. And we need to ask some of these bigger questions as to why these injustices exist in the first place.
Wow, Tony. I think that you nailed it in so many ways there. It seems to me that the way that we normally think about economics is it's all transactional, and the whole notion of the Good Samaritan is that it's not transactional. I mean, the Samaritan expects nothing in return. I just think that's a great insight on your part. And that kind of leads to my next question. One of the things that I was struck with in this, just reading it through, ahead of our discussion tonight, was how often His Holiness talks about the universal destination of all goods in this encyclical. And I guess my question, and look, I'll turn to you first, Tony, and then I'll ask you, Meghan, to jump in as well. Could you explain to us again what the universal destination of all goods is, and then maybe give us a hint of why His Holiness is talking about it so much in this encyclical?
Yeah, again, for me, a very simplified view, and Meghan can give a more deeper theological reflection. But I'll give my simplified view, which is that the idea is that the goods of the earth are destined for all people, without exception and without exclusion. It's about the goods of the earth and human labor are for meeting the needs of all people. And Pope John Paul II called that the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. So it was very important for Pope John Paul, as it is for Pope Francis. And Pope John Paul, and it's based on the idea that while private property is legitimate, it is not unconditional. And the condition is that you meet the needs of all people in the world without exception or exclusion. And Pope John Paul had a great way of putting that. He said it comes with a social mortgage. It comes with a social mortgage. So private property is okay. We're not against private property, but it's not absolute, as libertarians would claim, and it's not unconditional. And Pope Francis has said this many, many times throughout his pontificate, in all of his documents, in many of his speeches, including to popular movements. He's talked about the importance of the universal destinations of goods. And as an economist, I think it's one of the great standards of judgment for how an economy is actually functioning. Is an economy serving the good? How do you know? Is it meeting the universal destination of goods? To me, that's the real purpose of economics in the first place, why we have our discipline. But that gets so lost, especially when we get into neoliberalism and the defects of market ideology.
Meghan, a deeper theological explanation than if that was Tony's simple explanation. I'm curious to see what you have to say.
Well, so, I mean, a couple of things to kind of, why is this, what gets missed in most conversations? I was struck when the encyclical came out, how many people were acting like this was a new thing.
Yeah.
And it all, right, it was only really American conversations that were treating it as a new thing, not, you know, questions and conversations in Europe did not look the same. They didn't look the same in Africa either. One thing I would add is that the universal destination of created goods is first and foremost a statement about God and not about us. And that radically changes not only your conception of the common good, but everything you want to say about property as a result of that. And so when we say that creation is for the good of all, part of what we're saying, and Francis has made, right, this is the link between Fratelli Tutti or one of them, and Laudato Si, which is creation belongs to God, not to us. I mean, ultimately, private property always has to be derived, because otherwise the sheer arrogance, right? It's putting humanity in the place of God. That first and foremost, creation belongs to God and we are not God. And so that has to shift and shape how we talk about how goods get distributed, how people's needs get met. I have, you know, in class, we talk about how what happens in a college suite if nobody's responsible to clean the bathroom or the kitchen, right? The two things no one really wants to do. They get pretty gross, right? So the specialization and division of labor and property is something that functions for the common good. It's good that we have things that we are responsible for. Mm-hmm. But the problem comes when we reify that, right? And we think, well, no, it's mine. I mean, ultimately, nothing really is mine in the way that often libertarians talk about it, or consumerism talks about it. It's always, you know, this ties in as well with the language that creation, right? The goods of creation and the environment are really simply on loan, right? We're always renters. We are not owners of the world, even our small bit of property of it. And so I think this is why Francis always talks about land, labor, and lodging when he's talking to popular movements. Right. This sense that there's a moral claim that everyone's basic needs get met. And this is tied to the integrity of the natural world. But really, a lot of it is, you know, about, in a sense, humanity remembering both its dignity and its place, and that we are not God.
Well, let me just kind of push this a little bit. I want to go after this notion of private property. In section 120 of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis writes, and I'm quoting from him here, "The right to private property can only be considered a secondary natural right derived from the universal destination of created goods." Now, I don't know, with the screen in the way, I don't know if you can see it, but this is my iPhone. This is my property, right? So do I own this, or what is private property? What is this as private property for me now? How should I understand it through the lens of Fratelli Tutti, Tony?
I would go back to Thomas Aquinas, his distinction between private ownership and common use. That he basically says that, you know, you ought to possess external things, not as your own, but as common. You're ready to communicate them to people, communicate them as needed to people in need. So private property, like I said earlier, private property is legitimate, but it must always be subordinated to this concept of common use. And I think that something deeply relevant today is that Aquinas also qualified that by saying, in case of need, all things are common property. So
I remember we could, for example, food, bread in a window if you're starving is yours.
I call it the Jean Valjean principle, like Jean Valjean stealing a loaf of bread and getting locked away for 20 years, whereas Aquinas would have said Jean Valjean did nothing wrong. That wasn't theft. And you know, the same thing about the quote from Saint Ambrose that the popes like to use all the time, that, you know, the earth belongs to everyone, not just to the rich. You're appropriating things that are meant for the poor by hogging up too many goods. But I think it's very relevant, this Aquinas quote about in case of need, all things are common, because I think about vaccines. I mean, what is more in line with this universal destination of good than life-saving vaccines? I mean, it talks about a need. You need to save your life. You need not to die of COVID-19. That's about as basic as it gets, which is why Pope Francis has endorsed the people's vaccine to, you know, waive the intellectual property protections enjoyed by pharmaceutical companies that are basically going to their profits and their bottom line, while the 7.8 billion people in the world, the vast majority of them do not have access to vaccines. I just give this as an example because it's of contemporary relevance, and it kind of drives me crazy that we're not having deep discussions about this.
Yeah, I'm glad you used that as an example.
Yeah, so as an example of, you know, of the kind of
Action Network is actually held up, you know, in our public policy advocacy. So
yeah, so maybe you asked a deeper question, and I'm gonna I'm gonna let Meghan take the harder part.
Well, so I want to go back to your cell phone, and I want to say, okay, the cell phone is yours, but the cellular waves, right? The network isn't, and your cell phone is yours, but that always is going to involve a relationship with every person along the way that was part of getting that cell phone into your hands, which means the people that were mining the minerals, which means the people that were producing it, the people that were transporting it, the people who were selling it to you. And in those first three, oftentimes people who don't have access to the newest technology on the market, as well as the scientists and all of that go into, right? You have a relationship where questions of economic justice apply. And again, right, this doesn't make sense on an individual level. There are questions we can only seriously talk about when we look at the bigger system, right? And so it pushes us to think, and this circles back to the vaccine example, to think and talk about more seriously the things that are not privatizable, that cannot be claimed as private property. And it's not that medication and pharmaceuticals never can be, but in a pandemic, claims of property do not trump people's needs. But I mean, it's the same basic thing as saying those suffering from diabetes who need insulin, right, have a claim to access to that medication, no matter where they live, because they need it to live, right? And so the question of prices and distribution and the whole system, which is set up in terms of a private market, albeit that's a bit of an illusion, you know, in most places, because in the US, it's hugely subsidized by publicly, just the profits are privatized in terms of our medical research. But right, the whole lens through which we're having the conversation has to shift. But it's also why Paul Farmer has this, Dr. Paul Farmer from Partners in Health, who's heavily influenced by liberation theology, has this line that I always come back to, which is, you know, as science and technology advance, our social sin deepens, it doesn't alleviate.
Hmm.
Right? So our economic injustice, and this is why Francis is always talking about inequality. It deepens as our ability to meet those needs gets, right? We have that ability, and we are collectively, and by collectively, I mean those in power, choose not to.
I would like to bounce an idea off you. I could be completely off base with this idea. So tell me if I, but as I think about, well, for example, that passage from section 120 that I just read where Pope Francis referred to property as a secondary right. I mean, the way that I tend to think about it, and this is my answer to those people who claim, that labor theory of property that we see with Locke and Marx and so on and so forth, that think that it's my labor that creates this property. My argument would be, well, where does the capacity to do your labor come from? And, ultimately, whatever talent you have, whatever energy you have, whatever the food is that fuels your body to engage in labor, all that ultimately, goes back to God. It's all given to us by God. And so in a sense, I don't even own my own labor. And so I would argue, based on my reading here of this section of Fratelli Tutti, that it's not, I would say, even more than a secondary right, it's a derivative right. That property is always conditioned by the fact that we have to recognize, because of the universal destination of all goods, that all property ultimately is God's, including, our own labor and, our own bodies ultimately belong to God in the final analysis. Does that make sense to you guys?
Aquinas would talk about it as a derived right rooted in the universal destination of goods. But it's also, everything is a derived right from, the first principle, and therefore requires more context to see how would this apply in a particular historical context. The thing I would want to push back and say, right, we have to, it's all very nuanced. Right, is that it's always two things at once. It's always, right, the universal destination of goods is because God creates the goods of the earth, and then God creates all human persons and loves them all equally, right? So there's this universal human dignity that must be upheld. And when you have an unjust distribution in which people do not have their basic needs met, do not have access to clean water, etc., then that's always going to violate both the universal destination of goods, the option for the poor, and just basic, imago Dei theology. But also the element about the human person that gets missed, right, is because I don't want it, right, it's yes. What I think you want to nuance in the way you phrased it is human freedom is real.
Right.
And human capabilities is real. So part of what's important here is that when you don't have your basic needs met and you cannot develop right, so we don't have human flourishing and the ability to participate in the common good, part of what you take away when you devalue someone's labor or you take away their ability to participate is you're taking away their ability to live in relationship to neighbor and to God and be, as in theology we would talk about, co-creators with God in the societies in which they live. And so the violation, it isn't that, I don't own my labor, but it's that my labor is always relational, right? And John Paul II made this argument a lot, right? And again, we hear it from philosophers that it's not just that we're producing property by our labor. It's that we're producing ourselves and society by our labor. And what does it mean to alienate and devalue the contributions of people who do not have wealth and power, by the economic system?
Right. Well, let me kind of expand on that or drill in a little bit. This is from section 109 of Fratelli Tutti, where Pope Francis seems to reject a view of economic justice based merely on equal or formal economic rights. He says there, and I'm quoting from him, this is a little bit a longer quote, so I apologize. Some people are born into economically stable families, receive a fine education, grow up well nourished, or naturally possess great talent. They will certainly not need a proactive state. They need only claim their freedom. Yet the same rule clearly does not apply to a disabled person, to someone born in dire poverty, to those lacking a good education and with little access to adequate health care. If a society is governed primarily by the criteria of market freedom and efficiency, there is no place for such persons, and fraternity will remain just another vague ideal, unquote. Americans will listen to that and they'll think that what Pope Francis is advocating here is something like affirmative action. In other words, not formal equality in terms of economic rights, but rather, some effort to, in a material way, to balance things out and not have that kind of inequality. Is that the right way to interpret this? Maybe you could start with this one, Tony.
I think there's definitely something to that, Steve, the way you framed it. I think this is a very strong recurrent theme with Pope Francis that goes all the way back to Evangelii Gaudium when he talked about the throwaway culture, that people in the throwaway culture, people are not just at the bottom of society, they're not even part of society, they're excluded from society, not part. And so this is a great concern of his, a very practical concern of his when he speaks to the popular movements and the people, the great excluded masses from a global system of global capitalism. But I would argue that when I hear that as an economist, what I'm hearing is there needs to be an emphasis on reducing inequalities, not just formal equality of opportunity. You often hear this story that, well, we don't want equality of outcomes. We want equality of opportunities so then people can go as far as their natural skills and talents will take them. Let's set aside what John Rawls had to say about that for now. We can come back to it later if you like. But as an economist, I would argue that that's a false argument because there's such a strong relationship between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes. I want to appeal to something that Alan Kruger referred to as the Great Gatsby curve. The Great Gatsby curve shows a distinct relationship between inequality in a country and intergenerational mobility, how much movement there is between social classes in a country. And the answer is, in very unequal societies, you get very little social mobility. And that tells you that what's going on is that the rich are able to hog all the advantages for their children through education, through parental wealth, through systems of non-pecuniary advantages like internships and family connections and all this kind of cultural enhancements that children of poor families do not get, people born in dire poverty. I'll quote you a couple of statistics that people like Thomas Piketty and Branko Milanovic, two leading theoreticians of inequality, have discussed. So recently, only of the children that go to college in the United States, of the poorest households, only about a fifth of the children go to college. From the richest households, it's 90%. Of the top 38 colleges in the US, there are more students from the top 1% than in the bottom 60% of the population. Now you look at those statistics and you tell me that formal equality of opportunity is all you need and you don't need some kind of policies to deal with inequality. So to sum up, I would basically say that this is really getting at the reality and practice of pervasive structural inequalities in society that really undermine the common good, that shred the common good, I would argue.
Well, let me pick that up and turn it in Meghan's direction with a little bit of a twist. I mean, I cannot see that the current American system or the current global system that kind of is a combination of regulated capitalism and oligopoly, I'd say. You guys could put it a different way if you'd like. But I cannot see that it's going away, Meghan. So when you read Fratelli Tutti, is Pope Francis asking for a revolution here, or is he asking for reform? Are we supposed to try to to tear it all down and rebuild, or are we supposed to make what changes we can to interject more morality in the current system?
Well, I mean, I think Pope Francis is calling for a fairly substantial structural reform. The question of whether or not reform or revolution, those in power, we don't have a whole lot of historical evidence of those in power giving up power. And part of the problem is that you can't reform the system as power is distributed, right? And this is part of the shift, and part of it's historical, and part of it, that my biggest critique of economic justice for all in the 1980s from the US bishops is that they intentionally avoided inequality. I mean, they discussed and decided not to talk about it because everybody prefers to talk about things like a rising tide raises all boats.
Right.
Except that doesn't work, right? If you're in a yacht, or you're in what passes for a boat if you're trying to travel across the Mediterranean from North Africa to Lampedusa, a rising tide does not just raise all boats. We have to start talking about bad wealth, something that I'm the daughter of an economist who writes on the good wealth and bad wealth, and that we have all economic growth is not a good thing, right? It's growth of what, for what, and how does it affect people? So I think part of the problem is that the system as we have it now, in his COVID messages over the summer, Pope Francis talked about our current economy as its own virus. Right, as a virus that comes from a sick economy, right, and linking it to, right, just like we have COVID, right, we have an economic virus basically, and I think there's a lot to that's really important. The thing I want to add is that it isn't just about the rich and the poor; it's about everybody in the middle as well. All of the data that Tony was referencing, the work of Piketty, and the work of people like Wilkinson and Pickett on health and inequality, the work of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Institute, and I may have messed up their name, with Sabina Alkira and others at Oxford, and all the work that people like Amartya Sen, the development economist, have done, right, is that they show that it isn't just about the gap between the 1% and those in poverty, but in more equal societies, everybody flourishes more. I mean, and this is a big part of what the health research has showed, is that people are healthier. Again, you're not trying to make everyone the same in arithmetic equality, but if you think about that ladder of society, everyone, right, in the 20th percentile, the 40th, the 60th, the 80th, everyone except that very top does better when that ladder is shorter, right? So with the space between the rungs, right? So you're talking about is reform possible, or does it really require, a radical economic revolution. I mean, I think it's telling that the economists that Francis uses and listens to and is influenced by are not, they are not the mainstream of American capitalism. They're not the people that created that insignificantly influenced the economy we have now. They are people who think outside of that particular, free market box or mainstream neoclassical economic box. They are people who work on gratuitousness and the civil economy in Italy, and people who work on development like Sen and inequality by Stiglitz. Right, plenty of people who've won Nobel Prizes in economics, but have been left out of any conversation that's been dominated by American business and American financial interests for the last 30 years.
Well, that kind of tees up a question that I want to pose to Tony. And since you mentioned American economists, let me make an argument that one often hears in the Chicago School sorts of economics, and that is, look at what global capitalism, all the good global capitalism has done. In a material sense, the quality of the poor, the lives of the poor is much improved around the world as a result of global capitalism. And they're better dressed, they have better diets. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's capitalism that got us there. Is that not true? Or what would, Tony, maybe a better question is, from the perspective of Fratelli Tutti, what's the answer to that trickle down kind of argument?
Well, I think that Fratelli Tutti, as you know, very explicitly condemns trickle-down economics, condemns neoliberalism by name, which is, again, I think, a first for a papal encyclical. But I think the answer is, okay, a little bit of history, because trickle-down economics, what's the argument behind it? The argument behind it is that if you let the market operate on its own, without the government interfering, without unions, without crushing taxes, without regulations, without minimum wages, all these things that neoliberals do not like. If you get rid of all these things and let the market operate on its own, then you will get great prosperity. More technically, it says you will get rising productivity and longer-term economic growth. The problem is that never happened. And we have had 4 decades of an experiment, a natural experiment now in this. And we know that it has failed. It hasn't only failed on Pope Francis's terms, which are, I admit, different terms, but it's failed on its own terms. It has not delivered strong economic growth. If you look at the evidence from Robert Gordon, the economist, the leading expert on American economic growth, he shows statistics that demonstrate that productivity is 3 times higher in the period 1920 to 1970 than it is post-1970 period.
Wow.
Total factor productivity, which measures kind of innovation and ingenuity. So it's failed on its own terms. So I think Pope Francis is exactly right. You have evidence from the IMF, the IMF, which used to be a handmaiden for neoliberalism back in the 80s and the 90s, has argued that inequality lowers economic growth, that if you want higher economic growth, it rises up from the bottom, it doesn't trickle down from the top. And they have empirical evidence to show that. So I think there's been a great sea change. And I think it's because we have this 4-decade natural experiment that's just wrong. It just doesn't work. So it fails on its own terms. It leads to huge levels of inequality, corporate concentration, an environmental crisis. And I would even go far as to say it's leading to a kind of enhanced political crisis, because the amount of people who are being left out, who are being excluded from this economy, is causing all kinds of dangerous political backlashes that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic and in other parts of the world. So I think that it's time to say goodbye to neoliberalism and to move on to an economy that, as Pope Francis says, is healthier, more social, more human, and more integral.
We've only got about 5 minutes left before we open the lines to answer some questions from the audience. So but I'd like to get an answer from both of you. And this last question that I have is about the human person. The first part of Fratelli Tutti offers, I think, an extremely comprehensive critique of the way in which we understand the human person in our contemporary global economic arrangement. It goes after and maybe I could just kind of turn it over to you, Meghan. What's the conception of the human person that Pope Francis is holding up in Fratelli Tutti as different from the dominant way of thinking about the human person, the theological anthropology, so to speak, that seems to be working in contemporary global capitalism?
I'm a theologian, so I, very much hold, right, and think that this sense of the human person as created in the image and likeness of God, as personal and social, right, that we're always in community, is something I hold very dear. But to Tony's point before, right, the global financial system doesn't really, it has an operative view of rational economic man that has ruled, right, that experiment that Tony mentioned, right, in which people are motivated by self-interest and they make their decisions that way. And, and if everybody does that, somehow we will have, right, this flourishing society. And right. When you say it out loud, right, it does sound quite ridiculous, particularly because we make decisions that are not rooted in what we perceive as our own self-interest all the time, right? How many people stayed away from their parents and their grandparents until they could get vaccinated out of the interests of their loved ones, right? There's a very basic sense of if you just think about what does it mean to be part of a family,
relational,
of which every single person on the planet, whether they're married or not, whether they have children or not, is part of a family, and part of strong relationships, whether it's their birth family or friendship based, right? Everyone is part of a family. And that is a much better place to start than this conception of individuals, just making these narrow decisions in their own best interest. But also their economic interest is somehow what's defined as their best interest. And then we see people trying to make it.
Yeah, given the time we've got, let me see what Tony has to say on this as well. Tony?
I would just agree with Meghan. I think, there's a distinction. We are not just autonomous individuals in the John Locke libertarian sense. We are beings in relation. That comes out of Catholic theology, and Meghan has done a lot of the work on this, that we are made in the image of the Trinity as well as in the image of God. As an economist, I would say that we have a false anthropology. Economists say we are self-interested. We're not just self-interested. We're motivated by fraternity and relationship and social friendship and all the other virtues. It says our mode of operating is by competition. We are a cooperative species. We can tell this. We know this from evolution. We cooperate. We don't just compete. Economists say we maximize. We maximize our utility. We try and get as much stuff as possible on the market, and you cannot tell me that my tastes are wrong because I like what I like, and we're not like that. We are goal directed. We seek perfection. We don't just seek maximization. We don't just seek wealth. We seek relationships. We seek relational goods. We seek spiritual goods. We seek natural goods. So I just think our whole way of conceptualizing the economy is upside down, and it's just wrong. And if you're basing the underpinnings of an economy on so many wrong assumptions, is it any surprise that the predictions that come out of it just don't work?
I'm just completely blown away by this conversation, and I truly don't want it to stop. But I think we should open the doors to the questions from the hundreds and hundreds of people who are on this call. So I think my person, Jason Miller, will introduce himself and begin to pose some of the questions from the audience. Jason?
Yes, thanks so much, Steve. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Miller, the Director of Campaigns at the Franciscan Action Network. Wonderful conversation, Megan and Tony. Thank you so much. I think lots of good questions from our over 200 participants here on Zoom. Some questions about economics. So we're just gonna, even though those are the most recent, I'm just gonna start with those. So is growth the only measure of success in economics?
Tony? Sounds
No.
like you.
No, growth is not the only measure of success. Growth is very flawed. Growth is an aggregate, so therefore growth ignores all distributional issues. You can have very strong economic growth while a lot of people are being zeroed out, which is exactly what's happening today as the gains in growth accrue to the top 0.1% of the population. So one, growth ignores distribution. Two, growth ignores a whole bunch of things that are vital to the economy but are not remunerated, like care work. Just doesn't take into account at all. It just doesn't count it. And third, growth ignores those elements of integral human development that again have no place in the market economy, like relationships, meaning and purpose, nature, finding these intrinsic motivations that motivate all of us. So there's a lot of work in this area. The beyond growth agenda is a large one. Megan has mentioned people like Amartya Sen and Sabina Alkire from Oxford are working on different measures of human development and human well-being. Jeffrey Sachs works on something called the World Happiness Report, which is subjective well-being, asking people how their life evaluations go in a particular period of time, which actually gets at it's more subjective, but it gets at the more, I would say, Catholic Aristotelian ideas as to what matters to people, because surprisingly what matters is things like relationships and the freedom to pursue your capabilities and things like this. Okay, I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Tony. Megan, do you want to comment as well?
So two things, examples that help us think about why, right, economic growth or financial growth or the growth of the market. We hear a lot, right, whether or not the stock market's going up or down. Tony mentioned that lots of things aren't counted, like care work. And I wanted to just point out that this has a lot of gender implications, but part of the problem is that the whole system relies on care work that isn't counted and isn't remunerated. So there's all of this work and effort and things that people are doing, and much of the time it's done by women, that because it doesn't count as economic growth, the value judgments get made as if it's not there. And the pandemic has exposed a lot of those problems. I also once heard an example from an economist named Dean Baker giving a presentation that helped me think about this in terms of, all right, so if we shouldn't just talk about the growth of the market and financial growth, how should we think about financial growth, and how should we think about the financial industry, right? How should we think about Wall Street kind of thing? And Dean Baker said that we should think about the financial services industry the way we think about trucking. So the financial services industry should be only as big as what is needed in order to have the functioning of the global economy. You don't want the trucking industry to just grow for the sake of growing if you don't need more trucks to get our food and products from the port to the stores, right? So there is a right size to the trucking industry. So talking about growth for the sake of growth doesn't make sense if there's no, right? If we don't need the trucks to deliver our goods, and that we need to start thinking about the financial services industry and Wall Street in the same light. It is like trucking. It isn't something that should just grow in and of itself and expand to expand.
And
Help me
perhaps,
think about these things as someone who isn't a trained economist.
yeah, I was going to say, I'm definitely not an economist either, but perhaps the Department of Defense needs to use the same measure. Meghan, this next question's for you. Can you address how our understanding of private property has evolved from Leo XIII to Francis, or from Rerum Novarum to Fratelli Tutti?
Sure. And I promise to do this quickly. It is, so private property is upheld in Rerum Novarum. And I will say, as someone who, right, Catholic social teaching is what I do, it is most helpful to think about Rerum Novarum and 1931's Quadragesimo Anno as a unit, right? So to think about them together as the beginning of Catholic social teaching, as we talk about periods, right? And then we have the Vatican II period, John Paul II, we're now in Francis. And you could choose who you kind of want to put Benedict's contribution with in terms of these larger segments. And I say that because one of the challenges with Rerum Novarum is that those who worked on it kind of talked about private property more like John Locke than Thomas Aquinas. And historians have kind of looked at who was working on what and how. And very quickly, the tradition noticed that the way in which the private property gets emphasized makes it sound too absolute. And so the next document spends most of its time talking about the importance of the community and the common good, and kind of balances it out. And the reason I would say that that corrective is needed is in part because Rerum Novarum wants to present the Thomistic tradition on private property. And so it's where it gets that a little too close to John Locke and not close enough to Thomas Aquinas, that gets corrected pretty quickly. And then you see a fairly consistent pairing of the universal destination of goods and some sort of discussion of a social mortgage from every other so it's not just Leo XIII and Pope Francis. Every single pope after Leo XIII is always going to come back and frame. And what they're doing when they do that is being more faithful to the very tradition that Rerum Novarum was trying, right? Like itself talks about as if, right? It invokes Aquinas. And Leo did a lot to make clear that Leo was trying to lift up Aquinas's tradition here. And so that's where that consistency comes in. But the corrective is in bringing the tradition more in line with Aquinas, and then reflecting on Aquinas within contemporary context. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you, Meghan. Tony, this next one's, I'm going to assume it's for you, but this one might be a hard one. Please explain how capitalism can, in its current expression in the United States, ever be reconciled to the common good.
Oh boy, that's a rather open-ended question. I think that how can it be reconciled with the common good? I think addressing the three big E challenges, as I call them: employment, equality, and environment. So basically, deal with the fact that we're in a second Gilded Age, the fact that we have so much inequality, which, as Meghan noted, appealing to the work of Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, leads to so many social problems, and not just social problems, but psychological problems. Issues like anxiety and depression are elevated in more unequal societies. So deal with inequality, deal with the employment crisis, because the combination of technology and globalization have really hollowed out the working class in the United States. And this is leading to all kinds of dreadful political dysfunctions, I would argue. So deal with that. And there are plenty of ways you can do with that within a common good setting. Catholic social teaching has a bunch of teachings on the justice of just working relationships. So just wages, strong unions, co-determination, whereby workers have a say in the operating of a business and on boards of directors, worker cooperatives, all these kinds of areas. And then the third, of course, is deal with the existential crisis, that is the environmental crisis, most specifically climate change. And we all know what you need to do there. Decarbonize your economy completely by 2050, which is the single greatest technological challenge our planet has ever faced. And we have to do this in 30 years. So if you want to, that's my very quick answer. There are three ways you can align the US economy better with the common good, but I'm sure we can have 1,000 other answers if we want to delve into it more.
Thank you for that, Tony. And a follow-up that I think fits in really well. Is there too much disparity right now between the haves and have-nots? This person that asked this question noted that historically, anarchy, unrest, etc. follows.
Yes, and actually, there's a number of historians and economists have pointed out that inequality tends to rise throughout history, and it tends to fall only for bad reasons, due to wars, plagues, pandemics, social disruption. So that's a very pessimistic way. The one exception is the great social democratic experiment in the post-war period. In the US, you had the New Deal leading into Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. In Europe, you had the 30 golden years, the great Christian democratic, social democratic consensus, which had very strong economic growth and low inequality. So we've done it before, and we can do it again. I would just say that.
Wonderful, thank you. Meghan, could you discuss how Fratelli Tutti has expanded Catholic social teachings understanding with a particular emphasis on the universal destination of goods? And how might this help us understand and put into context the 7-year Laudato Si action plan for the church?
So I think one of the things that I think Francis is doing is I think he's pulling together what are the kind of foundational theological principles of Catholic social teaching, and kind of showing us how they're connected in ways. And one of the criticisms of Catholic social teaching is that there's not enough time spent looking at how things relate to each other, especially when there seems like there's some overlap and how that right. And so what I think he's doing is he's providing a way for us to think about care for creation, the universal destination of goods, and the option for the poor, which are I would say things that we should view as methodological principles in Catholic social teaching. So things that really should be at the core of how we're thinking about how we get from point A to point B and who we are, right? So are part of how we think about things, not just how we analyze them. And that's where, right, that creation of everything, while it's still fairly human-centered, it's less human-centered than previous Catholic social teaching in terms of reminding everyone that the natural world and creation has its own dignity and is loved by God, completely separate from humanity. And then, right, that question of our view of humanity as being tied to that we are all equally created in the image and likeness of God, all equally loved by God. And so he's in many senses, I think, bolstering the theology of Catholic social teaching by kind of taking a step back, and I think it's his pastor kind of sensibilities, and reminding us to think about all of this, and he's a Jesuit, right? All things in relationship to God in a way that helps us see the connection between people and planet as loved and valued by God. And then if we believe that, then how would that then be revealed in the way in which we treat one another and the way in which we treat the earth? And so that's what I think he's doing as kind of a broader kind of vision for which I think is a radical revolution. He did a TED Talk where he called for a radical revolution of tenderness. And I do, right? I think that's kind of the core of it is really rooted in his understanding and his, right, of the love of God as real. And what would it look like if we all lived as if we believed that and felt that kind of unconditional love for our, right, as individuals, but also as communities. I think it's a powerful challenge, but really is one that asks us to find God in all things, as you know, as any good Jesuit
As
would.
the Jesuits do, yes. Thank you for that, Meghan. Tony, I'm going to switch things up a little bit. This one is for you. How do you view universal basic income?
Oh, universal basic income, the UBI. Well, I think there are pros and cons, and I haven't formulated a very clear position on it just yet. I will notice that Pope Francis actually praised the UBI in a book he wrote last year called Let Us Dream, which is kind of a sequel, I would say, to his amazing COVID-19 discourses on Catholic social teaching, which Meghan mentioned. UBI has many advantages. It's a very good tool for eliminating poverty. It can reduce inequality. It can, stop people from being left behind in financial precariousness. The problem with UBI is, one, it can be very expensive, so people try and want to pay for it by cutting other social benefits, some of which I don't believe should be cut. And second, in a sense, it misdiagnoses the problem, because the problem is, the issue is really, we gain our dignity through our work. And this is a very strong theme in Catholic social teaching, the dignity of work. As Pope Francis says, work is part of meaning and fulfillment. It's who we come to, it's who we're meant to be. Pope John Paul says work makes us more fully human. So in that sense, if a libertarian comes out in favor of a UBI because so many workers are being excluded from the fruits of technological development, I don't think that's an ideal solution. I think that, I prefer my solutions. I prefer things like strong unions, minimum wages, co-determination, worker cooperatives, all these things of this socialization of the workbench. I think Pope John Paul phrased it. Maybe I got the phrase wrong. But I think the UBI has some major advantages, and it may well be what we need in the future. But I'm not fully convinced yet that would be my first choice in terms of policy.
All right, well, we know who you're voting for or not in the New York City mayoral race then, Tony. Meghan, you want to respond to that as well?
Well, I do, for a couple of reasons. One of which being my father's an economist who was writing on basic income back in the 1990s before it was cool. And one of the things that, and there's a theologian, Kate Ward at Marquette, who's doing fantastic work. Everybody should read Kate Ward on economic questions and basic income. That this is where data is helpful. right? So I'm more pro basic income than Tony, but in part because I refuse to concede the trade-offs that he just highlighted. I mean, I'm opposed to things that weaken unions or the minimum wage, but where they've had a basic income, and this has been across the developing level. So whether it be in Give Directly is massive, it's actually the largest of the experiments that have happened in Kenya, or in the Scandinavian countries, or Stockton, California, or the places in Canada, they have found that it doesn't negatively, all of the big fears economists who have had and claimed, right, this will make people not work, and this will depreciate wages and do this and that. It hasn't done that. Actually, people have worked more on average where they have had basic income, and it has allowed for social mobility, because it's allowed for the basic level, right, where you could apply for another job that's going to be a better job, that might be a union job, that you're not, because you're not afraid you won't be able to pay your rent. You're not, the anxiety impact it has had in even places like Scandinavia, which have a strong social network. And that in the time of the pandemic, it hasn't had the economic multipliers, the small businesses started and all of that have been reduced for obvious reasons. But in Kenya, what they found is significant social and resilience during the pandemic, that even as the economic measures, right, all those small businesses aren't all going to survive that had been started because they had access to the basic income money. Those that were getting the basic income money had much stronger emotional and social resilience to grapple with the pandemic and deal with it, in addition to things like nutrition going up, and all of that. And so the kind of part of where I agree with Tony and where it's rooted in the same thing is that we find is that human beings actually do want to work and contribute to society. And sometimes that just isn't valued economically in the same way, but also sometimes they're harbored and held back from being part of society in a whole host of ways because of economic instability that basic income has a chance to alleviate in some key ways, again, alongside other things, not as an alternative to them.
Yes, thank you for that, Megan. We are running out of time, and Steve is telling me that we are, but just one more question, because it is our good friend Ann, and if you could both just take 30 seconds to answer this. I know it's going to be hard, just 30 seconds, but we are running out of time. So how do you both think that President Biden's legislative agenda measures up to Catholic social teaching? Tony, do you want to take that first?
Okay, very quickly. I think it measures up quite well. I think we're seeing a return to the kind of economic policy making that we have not seen in this country since the FDR, LBJ period of time. So it's talking about, it's predicated on overcoming poverty, especially child poverty. It's predicated on solving the climate, doing what we can to solve the climate crisis. It's predicated upon the kind of jobs you need for dignified work. So yeah, I would say that's my 30 seconds. I would say pretty good job.
All right, thank you, Tony. Megan?
I think Catholic social teaching is very much in line with a broader understanding of infrastructure that includes care work and includes all of these other things, again, that tend to disproportionately affect women and families, that are a key part of his agenda. I also think the emphasis on racial justice is a place where a strong Biden agenda can push Catholic social teaching in the American church to be more in line with Catholic social teaching as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Megan. And thank you to you both. Steve, I'll let you take it from here.
I just want to go back and just say, how blown away I was by this evening's discussion and how very grateful I am to my two friends, Megan and Tony, for being with us tonight. This is the time too that I want to thank everyone in the audience who has stayed with us through this program. As was indicated at the beginning, the recording of this will be available to you after this session, and we'll be sending out a link probably tomorrow morning for those of you who would like to see it again. I especially want to thank all of our sponsors for this series of discussions. They've just, I think they've been terrific throughout, and I'm just really grateful for the support of our sponsors. I especially want to thank our staff for all of their work and behind the scenes in making this work. I mean, these things aren't easy to pull off, and I am just so grateful to each and every one of the Franciscan Action Network community that we've been able to make this work as well as possible. And then finally, I'd like to encourage everybody to attend our last in this series of discussions on Fratelli Tutti. And this is Fratelli Tutti on Governance and Politics, that will feature Professor Amy Ullman from Georgetown Law School and the well-known theologian, Professor David Cloutier from the Catholic University of America, talking about governance and politics, in particular talking about polarization in that talk. So that's coming up on the 16th of June, 2 weeks from tonight at 7 p.m. Hope you can attend. And with that, let me turn to our closing prayer and introduce to you our intern from the Catholic University of America, Fernando Cordova. Fernando.
Hello, and thank you again to our guests for joining us for this discussion. As we begin this closing prayer, I ask that you join us in a posture of prayer and however you feel comfortable. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Gracious God, as we close this discussion, we ask you enlighten our hearts and minds to spirit of generosity in challenging greed and neglect wherever it is seen, and aid those left behind, so we may all have a chance to flourish. We know that your love is infinite and that you care about all areas of our life. In this time of economic insecurity, help us to trust that all our security is in you. Keep us mindful that you always have and always will provide to our needs. Apart from you, we can do nothing. Merciful God, we ask that you give our leaders the wisdom to guide our nation and the world out of the current economic crisis. Help us to protect the poor and all those who are struggling during this difficult time. Provide for their needs and give them hope. Open new opportunities for them and furnish the resources they need to live with dignity. Encourage those who have enough to share essential resources with those who lack the necessities of life, and to do so with humble, grateful, and loving hearts. We ask for this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Fernando. Really appreciate it. And thank you all again. Good night and peace and all good.